The truce between Israel and Hamas was celebrated as a major diplomatic achievement, and this weekend showed why. Dozens of families were reunited after weeks of anguish. Gazans got a break from the constant fighting. Aid was allowed to flow into the enclave, and the displaced had a chance to calmly assess the damage. Now, on the final day of the initial deal, the agreement has been extended by 2 days. 20 more hostages will be released in exchange for 60 Palestinian prisoners. The announcement follows an international chorus asking for the ceasefire to continue, but Israel insists it won't be permanent. Among those already released is 9-year-old Emily Hand, a dual Irish-Israeli national. Emily marked her 9th birthday while held captive. Meanwhile, her family received a succession of devastating updates, first hearing that she'd been killed in the Hamas attacks of October 7th, and then being told she was actually among the hostages held in Gaza.
A loving embrace marks the end of an unimaginable ordeal and a peak of an emotional roller coaster, too complex to describe. Tom Hand thought he'd never see his daughter Emily again. He was told she was dead. For him, it was the better option of 2 horrifying scenarios.
It was unofficial. I was told that she was found in the kibbutz and she was found dead. I was relieved. I was relieved that she was dead and it was all over. It would have been pretty quick. Yeah, it was a relief thinking that she wasn't in Gaza. I preferred that.
But Emily was in Gaza, with no parent to turn to for comfort, no one to wish her a happy birthday when she turned 9. When Tom learned a mistake had been made, his world collapsed a second time.
In that moment, I was just thrown back into the nightmare. That just the sheer terror of a 9-year-old girl down in those dark tunnels, never seeing the light of day. But sheer terror, panic, every hour of every day. She must be saying every day, "Where's my daddy? Where's my daddy? Why isn't he coming to save me?" Nightmare.
The nightmare lasted 50 days. But slowly, very slowly, suffering made way for hope. When the news broke that Hamas would indeed release Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, the people of an entire country held their breath. From Tel Aviv to the Dead Sea, where evacuated residents from Kibbutz Be'eri had gathered to watch anxiously as Emily and others crossed the border.
This is so exciting. Yes, it was. This was joyful for the community of the kibbutz. They clapped and chanted. It was exciting for us all. We're united as one community.
Among the relieved crowd, a community member deeply involved in Emily's story.
I'm the one who told her father that she has been found murdered. And a week later, I'm the one who told the father that she probably captured. She's here, she's with us, and I have to tell his father to give him a hug and say I'm sorry again. So for me, it's a closure.
For Emily and her father, closure isn't likely to come so quickly. While the family is united again, it'll take much more than hugs to fix everything that broke during those 50 days in Gaza.
We can now speak to Professor Hagai LaVine. He's the head of the medical team of the Hostages Family Forum in Israel. He and his team help hostages returning home deal with the trauma they have experienced. Welcome back to the show, Mr. LaVine. Let me start with a personal question. How have these past 4 days been for you?
It's between hope and despair, because I had very exciting moments when, our dream come true, and some of the hostages returned to their families, returned to Israel home, and were, welcomed in Israeli hospitals, and some of them already at home. But at the same time, I was last night and today with Elma Abraham and their children, and extremely tough moments when she was brought here in critical condition after severe neglect for a long time. Clearly, she didn't receive her needed medications. She was beaten all over, probably from being treated like a sack of potato, transferred from a place to another, with body temperature of 28 Celsius degrees, and she now has facing, she's ventilated and facing life-threatening condition. And for a family, they had hopes, and they were shattered at once. So she didn't come back home, and actually her home was also violated at the October 7th massacre. And at the same time, while we are speaking, some hostages are released, but my heart and soul is not only with them, but also with the others that are still in Gaza, more than 150 hostages, that some of them need urgent medical care, and the Red Cross is still not allowed to enter there. So I have mixed feelings and strong feelings tonight.
The freed hostages you have met, you mentioned one there, but I'd like to get a bigger picture. What did they tell you about their time in captivity?
It depends. There are different stories. They were probably in different locations and different treatment. What strike really remarkably is the resilience and solidarity between the hostages. You know that we heard today that one hostage requested that instead of being released, she asked, please release the other woman. She's in worse conditions than I am, so please release her first, without knowing if she will be ever released. So, they shared the food. They didn't get enough food, but they shared the food and gave it to those who needs most. Together with that, it's very tough times, it depends for each one, but some of them said that they didn't take a shower for 51 days. Imagine what it would be for you or for any of us to be in such conditions. And now they have a long recovery process with their families, with the great health professionals. But again, at the same time, the others do not get the treatment they need to recover. And also, I met the mother of Maya Regev, that was released and underwent an operation in Soroka Medical Center. At the same time, her brother is still in captivity. And I met the family of Yafa Adar. At the same time, her grandson is still in captivity. So how could they be happy?
How can
really
former hostages, sorry to jump in there, but how can former hostages be prepared for a return to normal life, which in some cases has been completely upended? Their entire families have been killed. Family members continue in captivity. How can one medically, psychologically go about that? What kind of attention do they need right now?
So we are following 3 principles to be personal. So it depends on the individual, what he or she needs. To be professional, we have some knowledge, although some of the events here are first time in history, but it's like some of the lessons we learned from Holocaust survivors. For example, regarding diet, not to feed them at once. They have dietary deficiencies. They told that they didn't eat fruits and vegetables, and the diet was poor, but you cannot, correct it at once. And that's the 3rd principle, is to be patient, We need to, to give them some time to understand what happens in the meanwhile. Now they realize that they became famous worldwide. Now they realize that sometimes good news. Sometimes they thought that a mother that thought that her son was killed now realized that he was not killed. And on the other hand, some have to receive bad news about very close family members that I either murdered on the October 7th massacre who are still in captivity, and to hear that, today Nir Oz received 11 hostages, still 49 are still in Gaza, but they lost. They underwent genocide, and they lost so many of their friends. That's very difficult to hear, and our heart goes with them, with the families, and with those who are still in there.
This is Hagai LaVine, the head of the medical team of the Hostages Family Forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The announcement that the pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas has been extended for 2 additional days gives hope that more hostages may be walking free from captivity in Gaza. The Israeli government has been releasing footage of the moment hostages who were released on Sunday reunited with their families. On Monday, a group of 11 hostages left Gaza, bringing to 50 the number of Israelis who have returned home. Additional groups of 19 foreign nationals held by Hamas, most of them from Thailand, have also been released. It's believed about 180 hostages remain in captivity in the Gaza Strip. Danielle Gilbert is an assistant professor of political science at Northwestern University in Illinois, and she explores the causes and consequences of hostage taking. Danny, welcome to the day. We have seen dozens of hostages freed over the weekend in exchange for about triple the amount of Palestinian prisoners. Was that Hamas's goal when they abducted all those people on October 7th?
That's a great question. There are several different reasons why Hamas would have taken hostages, and certainly lots of different complicated reasons why they would have taken so many. But a prisoner exchange has likely always been part of their intention. Hamas has previously kidnapped Israelis and used them for prisoner swaps, and they've been talking about doing so since the early days after October 7th. So this was likely always at least one intention of their hostage taking.
What have we been able to learn about Hamas's hostage taking strategy from those that have been released in the past couple of days?
There's a few different things that we've learned from the hostages who have already come out of captivity. One is that we know that it was intentional, it was planned, it was part of the organization for the October 7th attack in the written documents that the Israeli military has found in their siege of Gaza, that they had practiced and prepared for this. That means that they had specific combatants who were trained and prepared to take hostages. They had resources prepared to hold hostages, to feed them for weeks on end. They had medical professionals within their combatant corps who have been providing medical attention to the hostages as well. And so a lot of those details have emerged from the hostages as they come out of captivity, telling us about what it was like to be with Hamas over the last 50 days.
How does that compare to other militant organizations that take hostages?
So one thing that is quite consistent across militant groups around the world in their kidnapping is that hostage taking is almost never a crime of opportunity. It is exquisitely premeditated and planned. Armed groups are quite intentional about their kidnapping, and that they focus on that role specialization, that it's someone's job to abduct the hostages in the first place, someone's job to guard them, watch them, care for them over time, and someone else's job to negotiate for their release. So that part is quite consistent. What was different about the October 7th kidnappings, and just one of the factors that made these kidnappings quite unprecedented, is the fact that Hamas took so many vulnerable hostages. It is exceedingly rare for an armed group to kidnap children or to kidnap the elderly, because if the intention is to hold hostages to negotiate them for some sort of concession, you have to keep your hostages alive. And that's much harder to do with children, with the elderly, with so many of their hostages who have been sick and injured without medication since the 7th of October.
So why would they then take so many vulnerable people? Because they were easy to kidnap?
It's a great question, and the full understanding of their intentions remains to be seen. It's entirely possible that some of the combatants and militants from the 7th of October got carried away and grabbed hostages that they didn't intend to take in the first place. We also know that there are hostage takers outside of Hamas who kidnapped on the 7th of October and have been holding hostages since then. So that's another militant group called Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And reporting has suggested that there's individuals within Gaza who are simply holding Israelis captive that they took on October 7th. And so we know much less about those other kidnappers and what they intended on the 7th of October.
Now, hostage taking is not a new phenomenon. In fact, you claim it's as old as the written word. Why are we seemingly witnessing a new rise of hostage diplomacy, for lack of a better word?
There's a lot of different reasons why we might be seeing so much hostage taking and a whole different range of actors that have been taking hostages. So kidnappings by Hamas, by armed groups, those kinds of actions have been incredibly common over the last 50 years or so. Actually, Palestinian militant organizations really pioneered hostage taking from airplane hijackings back in the 1970s. And since the 1980s, we've seen a lot more kidnappings. Over the last decade, we've also seen autocratic governments taking hostages through their criminal justice system. And at the end of the day, hostage takers take hostages because it works. It is extraordinarily effective at coercing enormous concessions from much more powerful governments that are taking great pains, but really struggling to stop this kind of violence.
Why do democratic nations struggle so much to find an answer to this kind of asymmetric warfare?
There is an inherent tension in hostage taking, especially when it comes to democratic countries that care about their own citizens, who are committed to bringing their citizens home, and that whatever a government can do today to bring back its hostages might incentivize the hostage taking of the future. So making concessions, whether that's paying a ransom or engaging in a prisoner swap or making other policy concessions, that teaches hostage takers around the world that hostage taking is quite successful. So that's one of the reasons that it is so attractive, at least in the short term, to perpetrators right now.
But the democratic world has kind of moved away from that premise of we don't negotiate with terrorists, though, haven't they?
They have, and countries have at various times claimed to have a no concessions policy. They've claimed that they don't make concessions to hostage takers, which in some countries' cases is variably true, and for most countries isn't true at all. Some countries have prohibitions specifically on paying ransoms to terrorist groups because that constitutes material support for terrorism. It's the same as making a donation to a terrorist organization. But in fact, most countries have the incentive to make an exception to that policy when their own citizens' lives are on the line. And so countries are really struggling with how do they get back to their own citizens today without incentivizing more hostage taking tomorrow.
Yeah. So how could Israel's response to this hostage crisis help avoid future mass kidnappings? What would need to happen for their response to really be a deterrent for the future?
It's a great question, and it's one that I imagine the Israeli government and certainly lots of other governments all around the world are thinking about, not only because of the October 7th attacks, but because of the rise in hostage taking around the world. And part of that is the challenge of coordinating across governments, of leaders getting together, agreeing on what it means to have someone taken hostage, agreeing on those concepts and definitions, international conventions and treaties to prohibit and to punish hostage taking. And largely, they're working on thinking about ways that they can punish and threaten the perpetrators of hostage taking. So when there have been past waves of hostage taking, whether that's airplane hijacking or kidnapping or embassy hostage taking attacks, it has taken the military force, security personnel of those governments for really threatening hostage takers, making it unlikely that they can succeed if they continue to take hostages.
Now, you have, of course, followed this situation that unfolded after the Hamas attack in Israel very closely. How do you think the hostage situation shaped the aftermath of October 7th?
In the first days after October 7th, one of the first things that we heard from Hamas about the hostages was that they were threatening to kill and publicly demonstrate that execution, to post videos online, to kill their hostages every time that the IDF launched an unannounced missile strike that hit civilians in Gaza. Effectively, an explicit threat to use the hostages as human shields. Thankfully, we didn't see that in the early days of this war after October 7th, but it's entirely possible the fact that there were more than 200 hostages underground in tunnels in Gaza might have delayed the Israeli military incursion. And at every level is probably shaping how the Israeli military is thinking about its force on the ground. On the flip side, the IDF is talking about the fact that the ground invasion, that their incursion into Gaza is what pressured Hamas to come to the table in the first place. So thinking about the relationship between Hamas holding all of those hostages and what the IDF has been willing to do, we might see that change dramatically at the end of this pause in hostilities if the IDF continues, if it resumes fighting as they have been threatening to do.
Fascinating insights. Thank you so much, Danielle Gilbert.